Hello and welcome to another episode of the South Dakota Forest Health Workshop Series. My name is still Tony Seidel, and it is my pleasure to act as your moderator for today's workshop about scale insects in South Dakota. This workshop is part of an ongoing series of virtual presentations focused on forest pests in South Dakota, and our goal is to engage with landowners and decision makers about current tree care trends. The Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources is an equal opportunity provider, and we encourage participation. As this series evolves, we welcome ideas for future topics, so feel free to leave suggestions in the chat box today or contact us directly. We also plan to have time for a few questions and a little Q&A at the end of this presentation. Any questions that arise during Dr. Ball's presentation can be placed in the chat box as well. Due to bandwidth concerns, all participant microphones and videos have been turned off, and we request that they stay this way during the presentation. The workshop is being recorded, and that recording will be placed on the department's YouTube channel for public viewing once it is reviewed by our technical support team. We have available Society of American Foresters and International Society of Arboriculture continued education credits available for attending this live workshop. A code will be given at the end of this workshop for ISA certifications, and please enter any SAF and ISA registration numbers in the chat box before you leave the meeting, please, today. I do see some familiar names in the audience, so please welcome back. Thank you for returning. And to those joining us, thank you and welcome. Today, Dr. Ball is back again, our forest health specialist and SDSU extension forester, here to discuss identification and management strategies related to various scale insects in our state. Dr. Ball, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Tony, and thank you everyone for participating today. You know, it's not as an exciting topic as emerald ash borer or pine wilt or a number of the others, but nevertheless, at this time of year, I get an awful lot of questions on scale insects, and we're also in the time period in which treatments are appropriate. So we're going to go over a little bit of the basic biology of them and then talk about the most common ones in the state. And then, of course, all the important management. And then at the very end, of course, the CEU code. So let's get her started here for today. Well, first of all, we're going to be talking about scales, and these are in the order Hemiptera for any budding entomologists out there. And you can see this picture with my thumb there is showing quite a few of these small insects on the trunk of that aspen tree. So let's start out with their life cycle, which is a little unusual compared to a lot of other insects. They do have an adult stage. The adult stage is sessile. They are the original couch potatoes. They're not going to move at all. Kind of like us. You get older, you get kind of sedentary. You just want to sit in front of the TV with a beer and you're pretty happy. That's pretty much what a scale is. Now, the eggs are laid underneath the adult scale, and quite often after the eggs hatch underneath their dead mom and emerge out, and then they scurry about and they have a nymphal stage. And we refer to those as crawlers. And this is the mobile stage. They're going to scurry about until they find a place to feed. Now, they're going to go through several molts. So we often see that the first instar, the first phase of the nymphal stage, is the one that is mobile and runs about till it finds a place to feed. And then the second one may be a settled crawler. And then finally, they're completely settled and do not move at all. And so some, they scurry about during their entire nymphal stage, and some, no, after about even as short as a week or two, have found a place to feed, and they'll sit there, gradually lose their legs, their eyes, their antennae. Again, they're becoming the couch potato, and then become the adults. The adults are generally immobile. And by general, I mean at the conclusion of their stage, they're all immobile. but some at the beginning still have a little bit of mobility, but not very many. So the adults are there at one point. These are pine needle scales on a spruce. Pine needle scale's not very good at tree ID, so it'll attack spruce trees as well as pine trees. And what you're looking at are the adults, and the adults are not going to move. If you came back and looked at this an hour later, if you were out there looking at these needles, they're exactly where you left them. Now, there may only be females, but I'll tell you, if you see a scale, it is a female. The male adults look like little gnats, and I mean very little gnats, and only live for a very brief time period in which to mate, and then they quickly die. And in some, only females are known. There are no males. And of course, now we have asexual reproduction for them, which kind of narrows their gene pool a little bit, and they become very, very specialized on the particular plant which they're found. It's quite interesting. They may not even move to another pine, even if the branches overlap, because now they're kind of tailored to that particular plant. The eggs, after they hatch beneath the scale of mom, and this is another pine needle scale here, and you can see little crawlers. They're crawling over their dead mother. Kind of interesting or morbid. And this is the stage that's going to move about and find another place to feed. This is also the stage that is very susceptible to chemical pesticides. In other words, if you apply something onto the plant, it's going to hit them and kill them. And by the way, I also should mention, these are also very vulnerable to a host of parasitoid and predators, and that apparently they're pretty tasty. And you can see here the crawlers. Crawlers are the mobile stage. Now that mobility might last only a week or two. For some scales, it might last months. For others, some they're mobile throughout the entire summer and fall, and actually have a little mobility the following spring. The crawlers actually overwinter for some scale insects. And so they're mobile for most of the year before they become, again, settled adults, the couch potatoes. And at that point, they're going to lay eggs, and the cycle is repeated. And here you're taking a look at one of the crawlers. Now, this is a crawler that's already beginning to lose its legs to it. The crawlers may feed on the leaves, needles, or broadleaf foliage, or just the shoot, and it depends on the species. And in some cases, the adult scale is found on the twig, but the crawlers are found in the foliage. They'll go out to the foliage feed for a while and then come back to the twig to become settled. Well, let's take a look, because we have two different types of scales, two broad groups. The armored scale and the soft scale. And it's important to know the difference between the two, because it has a lot to do with our management. First of all, the armored scale has a shell made of mostly of proteins, a little bit of wax, and the shell completely encloses the body, but not attached to it. In other words, if you could take a very, very fine little razor blade and peel the shell off, you'll find a soft-bodied insect beneath it. Now, it's not going to scurry away because it's already lost its mobility. For the soft scales, they have a shell that's made up of wax that's really comes from their body, and it's attached to the upper side. Okay, and you can't separate the two. The other difference is how they feed. If you take a look at the armored scale, I made kind of a little drawing there with its mouth parts there. Think of that as a plumber snake. It will literally move around and feed from individual cells, kind of sucking the contents out of them. And soft scale has just kind of a straight mouth part, and it taps directly into the sap and will suck the sap out of it. And that has the difference in feeding going into individual cell contents or going to the phloem tissue plays a big role into how we manage them. A couple of other things: the eggs that are laid beneath the adult scales for the armored scale, usually tens of eggs. They might lay 20 or 30 eggs. For soft scales, you see hundreds of eggs laid underneath the female shell. And a couple of other differences there. The eggs hatch over a fairly short time period for the armored scales, might be only a week or two, and the crawlers might be only mobile for another week or so. Meaning that if you're going to spray something on the foliage or on the twig to kill these, you've got a pretty narrow window in which to apply that product. The soft scales, on the other hand, hatch over a longer time period. They may hatch over a 4 to 6 week time period, which means that you may need to treat more than once, for example, because they're not all coming out at the same time, or at least make sure you're getting near the peak. The crawlers are mobile for a long time. They often migrate out to the leaves and will feed on those and then migrate back to the shoot in the fall. And again, what you're looking at here is the female scale. The adult male looks like just a very, very small gnat. Generally does not feed. It's not even needed. How's that for being a worthless dad? And lives for a very short time period. And as I also mentioned, in some of these, we don't even know if a male exists. They figured out how to get along without us. All right, how do they injure the host? Now, first, one of the biggest complaints is this production of honeydew. Now, only soft scales produce honeydew. So the armored scales will not. We'll talk a little bit about why later on, but it has to do where they're feeding. Remember, the soft scales actually tap right into the sap. And since it's under pressure, it almost flows through them. And they excrete a large amount of it out. And it's kind of a very sweet, sugary substance. A lot of other things like to feed on it, by the way. But the problem with that honeydew is it's going to leave a sticky film on the leaves of any tree. Right now, I'm starting to get calls from people. They say, well, you know, the maple leaves are coming out and they're all sticky. Well, that's due to the honeydew that these insects are excreting out. Some of the other things is you can find them covering windows. Look at that window. And the call was not because there was an insect, though they suspected something must be doing this. But the reason I was called is they said our windows are covered with this film. You'll also find the film on any cars that are beneath the trees, any patio furniture beneath the trees. And again, that's going to occur on the soft scales that are excreting out all this honeydew. Now, by the way, that honeydew is incredibly sweet. And I'm just reading that. I've not tasted it. But nevertheless, ants really like it. And they'll actually protect scales, much as they do aphids, which also excrete honeydew, in order to harvest that sweet substance, as they're doing here off a cottony maple scale. The other problem with that honeydew, which again creates that sticky film, and I mean literally you're scraping it off windshields of cars. I should also mention that there are products out there that will remove honeydew from car windshields and windows. Yes, it can be that hard of a surface. Usually good soap and elbow grease will take care of it, but not always. The other thing is not only do ants like this honeydew, is there's sooty mold, a fungus really, that likes to feed on it as well. And it's a very, very dark, almost a powdery black substance. And you can see it here. Now there's also scales in there. You see the little shiny ones. Those are the pine tortoise scales. And we'll chat about them a little bit later on. But they're also, since they're a soft scale, they're producing the honeydew. And that sticky substance is a food source for the sooty mold, which is developing on it. Now, usually it's not enough to affect photosynthesis. Yeah, to some degree it will. Obviously, it's blocking sunlight from the tissue. But really, it's more of an aesthetic problem. You look at leaves and twigs and branches, and I've seen mugo pines that are almost black, almost like coal. They're so covered with this. So a lot of our problems with scales are aesthetics. that we don't like the honeydew they produce. Again, those are from the soft scales, or the sooty mold that lives on it, or the mess it makes beneath the trees. But they also can be deadly to the trees. I took this picture in Pierre, South Dakota. And what you're looking at are ash trees. And these ash trees are going around the streets. That's actually the governor's home in the background there. I took this picture several years ago now. But what this is this was a huge outbreak of oyster shell scale, which is an armored scale. So it was not sticky beneath the tree. It was not sticky on the sidewalk or that. But we were getting all this dieback. And of course, the call that I received was, oh my goodness, are we seeing emerald ash borer in Pierre? And no, in fact, we have not confirmed it in Pierre yet. But nevertheless, they were having a major outbreak of oyster shell scale. And it was so thick on those twigs and branches that you could barely see any bark. They were literally almost over top of one another. And remember, they're sucking the contents of the cells out, in this case, the oyster shell scales, and it's removing that food stuff from the trees. And they can remove about 20%. And you're going to get a lot of dieback then. So very heavy scale populations can result in dieback and decline of their hosts. Another interesting thing is one of the things you'll notice, and I took this picture this spring in Rapid City at one of the HOAs, is they took me out and they said, well, we have some aspen trees that are really late in leafing out. And if you look, they were going to leaf out, not completely, but they were a little behind other aspen. And that's also another indicator of scale populations on them, fairly heavy scale populations on them. So I walked over and I said, well, I'll bet that tree has scales. And it certainly did. And by the way, the other way I could tell that that tree was probably covered with scales is if you look at this picture and you look at this, and again, it's a quaking aspen tree. But if you take a look at the bark coming down there, you'll notice that it's all cracked and fissured. And that's what happens with scales. And look how thick that population was on that tree. It's almost like you couldn't see the bark. Now, quite often this is missed by the homeowner because, again, what you're looking at are insects that are not moving. And the mobile stage, the crawlers, are so tiny, you're not going to be able to see them scurrying about unless you've got a real good hand lens or a microscope out there. So scale populations are quite often missed. Again, usually homeowners will call when they say, well, my tree is dying. Okay, well, scales may be a case. Or a more common, my tree is weeping, which means that sticky honeydew is dripping down from the tree, or literally in some cases raining down as almost a fine mist. Obviously, this bark cracking in that can end up being harmful to the tree as well. So while the majority of our scale populations are really just a nuisance to us and are not seriously harming the tree, they can become so dense that they can contribute to the decline of the tree. They can also serve as a secondary stress and weaken the tree to the point that a boar can come in and attack it as well. So they are a group of insects that do require management in some cases. Well, as I mentioned, we have two types of scales. We have the armored scales and the soft scales out there. And the armored scales feed on the cell contents, usually in the cambium tissue that's generating new phloem on the outside and new xylem on the inside. In other words, carrying the sugars, that's what the phloems do, and then carrying the water, that's what the xylem does. They form that very hard, waxy shell that's covering the body, much like a turtle, if you will, and the insect is just beneath it. Now, they can sometimes have 2 generations per year. If you go in the literature, you'll find a number of these that I'll talk about today that say 2 or sometimes even 3 generations a year. And then you'll look where you read it from, and it was an extension publication from North Carolina, for example, which has warmer, longer summers than we do. So some that I'll talk about only have a single generation in South Dakota, but further south and east may have multiple generations. The soft scales feed directly in that phloem tissue. So they are sap sucking, and they form that kind of waxy shell that's really part of their body. Since they're feeding right in that sweet, sugary phloem tissue, that sap flow, they're going to produce honeydew because they're actually absorbing it so fast. They can't utilize it at all. I mean, sap's kind of like beer. You rent it, you don't own it. So it's going to come out the other end of these insects and form that kind of tacky, sticky surface beneath. These do, with some exceptions, only have 1 generation per year. And remember, too, that they produce hundreds of eggs, and those eggs hatch over a longer time period. And the mobility of their young, the nymphs, actually extends over a longer time period as well. So if we take a look, they both have this piercing, sucking mouth part. Think of it a little like a mosquito, if you will. They're going to pierce the tissue and then, in this case, suck the contents out. The armored scales here on the left, as I point out, feed kind of in the phloem tissue. In the cambial tissue, which is just beneath the phloem tissue. And they form what we call a test. That's that protein shell that's covered up, made from waste products on them. Whereas the soft scales feed in the phloem tissue itself. They feed right in the sieve tubes, if you will. And because of that, they're going to produce that honeydew that kind of is excreted out of it. Now, the soft scale nymphs may feed on the foliage. My diagram here, and it's just merely to illustrate, it's not all anatomically correct, just kind of shows how they're going to feed. But the soft scales often feed on the foliage as well. They'll kind of move out to the foliage as they crawl up beneath the dead mom on the twig. And then in the fall, they'll move back to the twig to complete their development. Let's take a look at some common ones. We've got about 8, 4 on broadleaf trees and 4 on conifers. So I'm going to go, and by the way, these are the bulk of them in our state. We're fortunate we don't have a lot more. We do have a few, so I'm not saying we're talking about all of them, but the nice thing about South Dakota, we can actually cover the vast majority of them here. And let's go over one that's just beginning to be noticeable now, and that's the cottony maple scale. To me, it reminds me of Jiffy Pop. Look at that white little bag there. And by the way, that's what we call an ovisac. It's filled with literally hundreds and hundreds of eggs. And this is a soft scale, meaning it produces honeydew. It's very common on silver maples. In fact, you can find it on many in most of the communities in South Dakota. And it also can be found on little leaf linden. Look at how thick it is on this one. And you can even see a little bit of that honeydew glistening off these as well. But literally on this tree, it was covered. Now, what's quite interesting about this is there's 3 little leaf lindens. They're all right next to each other. Only one of them is infested, and it stayed infested for years. Yet the infestation did not move to the other 2 trees, despite the fact they're very close to one another. So it's kind of interesting how finely they become attuned to their host, and sometimes do not transfer very easily from one tree to an adjacent tree. Now, other times they can, of course. And you might ask, well, how do they move if you don't fly? They can be carried by the wind. The little nymphs, that little crawler, is so tiny, it can easily be dislodged and carried by wind to perhaps another tree if it's fortunate to fall there rather than the asphalt out there on Maderi. Birds will actually carry them as well. Give you a little tip. One of the things that I've noticed is if you put bird feeders up next to your little mugo pines, you'll quite often end up with scales on the mugo pines. Because birds, as they're on a tree, will pick up a few of these on their legs. You know, the little nymphs figures it's a good way to fly, and they'll carry them wherever they're going next. So birds can be a way of moving these as well. Well, where do we find cottony maple scale? Again, it's not very good at ID. So we can find it on basswoods and little leaf lindens. We can also find them on buckeyes. Now, what's quite interesting is I don't find that much in the literature. But as you can see here we have one that is literally just covered with them. And the other very common host is silver maple. Now, I might add, there is another scale, the cottony maple leaf scale, which I'm not showing, in which you'll find that little mass on the individual leaves. We do not really see that in South Dakota. We have the cottony maple scale, so you're going to find that little cottony mass on the twigs. This is a picture I took just a couple of weeks ago. We have the immature female that's beginning to develop and produce eggs, and that the adult is about 3/8 of an inch on it. And again, they settle on the twigs. And there's that ovisac completely open, which we'll see that in the next couple of weeks here. Eggs begin hatching when Japanese tree lilac is in bloom. And that's at about 800 growing degree days, base 50. So we're not quite there yet. Degree days and phenology, when things bloom, are important clues as to when to spray. Because you don't want to be spraying at a time period where those crawlers are not present. So having this information is very valuable for timing when to treat. And then let's take a look at the life cycle here. Again, we have one generation per year. The adults will be out here laying eggs. They're laying eggs now, beginning to, and those eggs are going to start hatching towards the end of June. And since it's soft scale, they hatch over a fairly long time period, with crawlers moving to the underside of the leaves to feed, and then move back in the fall after they mate. And they overwinter as immature females, and they will feed a little in the spring. So you'll get some honeydew production in the spring as well. The next one is European elm scale. It has this kind of white fringe around it, so that makes it fairly noticeable. And take a look at this close-up. This is a twig that got sent to me. And you can see that white fringe around kind of the reddish brown adult scale. Now, these are very common in American elms in our state. And quite often I find that you'll see the trees flagging. In other words, the leaves turning yellow. And even beginning to wilt in mid to late summer with very heavy populations of the European elm scale. So much so that I've seen some trees that have been marked as Dutch elm disease infected when they were not infected with Dutch elm disease at all. That in fact, the scales were causing the wilting and flagging, the yellowing of foliage. So it's important, particularly in late summer, to make sure that you've eliminated this as a possibility for the symptoms, rather than just assuming that the tree has Dutch elm disease. But I see very heavy populations of this. Now, for this one, the crawlers begin hatching about 800 to about 1050 growing degree days, and about when little leaf linden starts to bloom to when it's in full bloom. So this is still a few weeks away as well. And that the life cycle here, again, the adults are laying the eggs right now. The eggs are going to hatch in end of June, and there, since it's soft scale, you're going to find them out for about 4 weeks or more. Crawlers are going to move out to the leaves and feed on the underside. And again, they return to the shoots in the fall, overwinter in bark crevices, and then become adults in the spring, which again is the very noticeable stage. They're all producing honeydew though. So those crawlers that are out on the leaves are going to leave that sticky film, which will be covered with sooty mold. Now, aphids can do that as well on elms, but nevertheless, European elm scale is very common, particularly in eastern South Dakota. Leucanium scales are another one. There are actually a lot of different leucanium scales that are out there. The European fruit leucanium scales, probably one of the most common, and that's what I have pictured here. Take a look at that droplet of honeydew. The branch was almost sticky from this one, and this was on an ash tree. The adults are kind of reddish to dark brown, about an eighth to 1/6 of an inch diameter, fairly large. And I'll find a lot of these on ash, particularly in Sioux Falls and in Aberdeen, fairly high populations there. I'll talk about why a little bit later. But very, very common scale insect. Occasionally someone will call me and think their ash tree is emerald ash borer, and it's actually a very heavy population of this insect sucking the sap out of the tree. Now, they're going to be hatching a little sooner than the previous two I mentioned, about 770 growing degree days, about time cockspur hawthorn is finished blooming. They're blooming right now in Sioux Falls and in Brookings, so I would expect the egg hatch for this one is going to occur fairly soon. And when it does, of course, that's when the crawlers are very vulnerable for management, and that's a good time to go out and do treatments. Take a look at our general life cycle for Leucanium scale. Again, very similar to what we've covered already. Hundreds of eggs laid. They're going to hatch in over four more weeks. So there's a fairly long time period in which you're going to see eggs hatching. It's not that it takes them 4 weeks to hatch. It's just you're going to have hatching over that long of a time period. And then the crawlers are going to move out to the leaves, feed on the underside, barely noticeable unless you're looking for them, but you'll see that stickiness to the leaves. Then they're going to return back to the shoot. They overwinter, and then in the spring you'll find those adults out on the twigs, and again you'll see that honeydew production as well. Now we have some armored scales that attack broadleaf trees, and this is the oyster shell scale. You can probably see where it gets the name. It looks like little oysters. It's an armored scale, so you're never going to get that sticky material. The first indicator that a tree has this may be dieback on the tree, and then the homeowner notices that the bark looks different. And it's why? Because look at this one. It literally covered that thick with scales. Sometimes you can literally carve your name on a tree just by cutting through the scales. They're fairly small, about an eighth of an inch, gray to kind of a brown, and they are shaped like oyster shell scales. Now, I might mention too that the adult scale doesn't live very long, but that shell will remain on for a couple of years. And so you really want to look at the newest tissue to see what the scale population looks like. If you're looking at 2 or 3 year old shoots, you might be looking at the shell of long since dead scales. But you can see on this one, it's right out there in the growth that occurred this last year. And that's a picture I took last year. Oh, now look at that. That is an ash tree in Rapid City, South Dakota. It's sprouting. It has dieback. You look at that and you think, oh my goodness, it's emerald ash borer. And then you get up close and it was literally covered with oyster shell scale. Now, oyster shell scale was serving as a secondary on here, and the trees were also being attacked by our native clearwing ash borer. So quite often these will work in concert with another insect to finish off the tree, but literally these are dying. Now, oyster shell scale has a lot of hosts. Ash is very, very common. Aspen is very common, though I might mention there's another scale that attacks aspen as well. It's fairly close. Dogwoods, the red osier dogwoods. Lilacs, common lilac. Silver maple, yeah, they attack them as well. And willow, though there's also a willow scale as well that looks relatively close. Oyster shell scale egg hatch begins at about 550 growing degree days, about the time Miss Kim Lilac blooms, which is blooming now, almost finishing bloom in the southeastern part of our state. So we are just entering the window to be treating for oyster shell scale. Hence the reason for doing this broadcast today, if you will, because we're just entering a good time period to start doing treatments for a lot of our scales, as you no doubt can tell here. If you take a look, the eggs overwinter. Look how long the eggs are on that plant, from October all the way through June. And they're going to hatch over about a 2 to 3 week time period. So throughout the entire winter is the egg stage. Now the eggs are underneath their dead mom. All right, so you'll just see the shells, but they're going to crawl on underneath her, starting here pretty quick. In fact, right now. And they'll be doing that over a very short time period. And the crawlers are only mobile for about a week. In other words, they scurry about very quickly. They stay right on the twig. They don't move out to the leaf. They don't have enough time. And they find a spot near dead mom, usually out on the newer growth. And they're going to settle there and then gradually become an adult, live for a relatively short period. Eggs are laid underneath mom. Mom dies. And then the eggs hatch the following spring. Let's take a look at some common scales for coniferous trees. Fletcher scale. See that little dot? Actually, several dots on this. Those are Fletcher scales on arborvitae. Now, this is a soft scale. So you're right. What you're going to find here is stickiness and sooty mold. Now, the only reason I got a call for this particular plant, and it's not really visible on the picture that you're seeing here, is they're wondering why they're getting this black kind of powder on their arborvitaes next to the house. And when I went up and looked, they were literally covered with Fletcher scale. The adult scale, again, is sessile, and they're about round 3/8 of an inch, kind of a very deep brown as they develop. And you notice they're very small. And again, since they're sessile, they're easily missed. Most people, you have to really point them out and say, do you know that's an insect? And they're kind of intrigued by an insect that doesn't move. That looks more like a shiny bump on the twig or the leaf. I will say too that winter desiccation injury and Fletcher scale are very common on arborvitae this spring. You know, this is a hedgerow in Miller, South Dakota that I got called out to take a look at. And our winter was very hard on arborvitae. Last fall was dry, winter was dry. So we've seen a lot of winter damage on them. But remember too, that if our plants go into winter stress, they're more vulnerable to this sort of damage. And this was literally covered with Fletcher scale. Now, the interesting thing, as I mentioned before, they get very finely attuned to their host. The ones that showed the most winter burn were the ones that were most infested with the Fletcher scale. And some that looked pretty good, I couldn't find any scales on them at all. So again, doesn't mean you had to have Fletcher scale to see winter desiccation injury this winter. No, you didn't. But just pointing out that these can be a secondary pest that really adds stress to the plant and kind of push it over the edge. Fletcher scale eggs hatch at a beginning at about 730 growing degree days. We're just about there. It's about when mock orange is in bloom, and they haven't bloomed yet in Brookings and that, but we're coming up to that time period for treatment, relatively close now. And if you take a look at this, again, it's a soft scale, so we're going to have hundreds of eggs laid, hatching over about a 4-week time period or so. The crawlers move out to the tips of the branches to feed on the foliage. They're going to overwinter, and then we're going to have the adults for a rather brief time period. But as I mentioned, you can find older scales for a year or two. The mom's long since been dead, but the shell's still there and adheres to the plant a little sticky for a year or two. So you can find the adult scale at almost any time you look. Just you have to realize that a lot of them are dead, but indicate to you that, wait a minute, I'll bet the crawlers are on here if I got it under a scope. Pine needle scales, probably my best example of that. Those old dead scales will hang on to needles for literally years. It'll make the trees look like they were flocked for Christmas. This is an armored scale, and I showed you this picture before. You're looking at the adult female scales to it. They are oyster shell shaped, about 1/8 of an inch, white to gray, and they have that little yellow spot you can see on this spruce needle, really at the narrow end. And again, if you were able to pry that back, you could find it. In fact, in the winter, you pry it back, you can find the eggs underneath it. But we're going to see the crawlers, and that picture's a couple of years ago. We're going to see the crawlers start hatching out here, or actually have hatched out here and are beginning to move around. Common hosts, Mugo and Scots pines. I took this one in, I think that I took this in Miller. And look at that needles. Don't they look almost flocked? They were covered that heavily with pine needle scale. Now, the first generation egg hatches from about 300 to 500 growing degree days. So they've already started hatching. They start hatching when common lilac is in bloom, and that period has ended. So in other words, this scale the crawler has already moved about and is already beginning to settle and has found a place on the needles to begin to feed. It's still vulnerable for pesticide applications, but it's already beginning to settle. Now, this does have 2 generations per year. Again, armored scales can do that. And the second egg hatch is going to be about 1,200 to 1,600 growing degree days, about when false cypress begins to bloom. The adults here, you can see I got 2 stages here. Eggs are going to overwinter. They overwinter for a long time period. They hatch over about 2 to 3 weeks. The first crawlers go out to the old needles because that's really all that's completely expanded at that time, and will feed, become adults, lay eggs, and then the second generation crawlers move out to the new needles. Those are the ones that are probably most noticeable because they're now really out on the tips and that, but you can find these literally covered, old foliage and new foliage, by this particular insect, the pine needle scale. And it has a close relative, which is a soft scale rather than a hard scale, and that's a pine tortoise shell. Pine tortoise scale. And you can see why it gets a name. It looks like little tortoises, but it's a soft scale. So unlike the pine needle scale, it's an armored scale, does not produce honeydew. This one's a soft scale and certainly will. In fact, one of its biggest problems is you'll find the needles just covered. These are about 1/4 of an inch. Quite often the soft scales are larger, kind of like bumps, helmet shaped, tortoise shaped, and this is kind of a reddish brown color to it. Most common hosts, Mugo pines and Scots pines. You don't usually find them on many other trees, many other pines, I should say, but you can. But I'll find Mugo pines literally just covered with these. And again, that black coating from the sooty mold, because these do produce just an incredible amount of honeydew. Now, pine tortoise scale eggs hatch at about 600 growing degree days, about when smoke bush blooms, which is just beginning. So again, we're coming up to the time period for treatments very, very quickly in a lot of areas of the state. And egg hatch occurs over a very long time period, which again is very common with our soft scales. And so it's going to end about the time lindens have reached peak bloom. So treatments actually occur over a fairly long time period here. And if you look at the life cycle here, again, hundreds of eggs laid, and they're going to be hatching over about a four week plus time period. The crawlers move out to feed at the shoot whorls there, and then they overwinter as immatures, resume feeding in the spring, and then of course the adults lay the eggs, with honeydew being produced almost during this entire cycle. Should mention too, there's a stripe scale. This looks an awful lot like the pine tortoise scale, except you'll notice it has these cream stripes running lengthwise on the shell. I find this more West River than East River. In fact, if I go out and take a look at ponderosa pines, I can find this on ponderosa pines. Again, it's going to make a very sticky goo on it beneath the trees. Everything will be sticky in that, and that's due to the stripe scale. Has a similar life cycle as the pine tortoise scale. They're very, very closely related. And then the spruce bud scale literally looks like a bud, so it's easily missed. And this is another soft scale, and you can see on the picture there's mom, the big scale right there in the center, and just beneath it, you see that flattened crawler there? By flattened, I mean it wasn't smashed. That's its shape. They're kind of that small elliptical, and it's heading out on a needle to do a little feeding. And that the spruce bud scale literally looks like a bud. They are found at the whorls where the branches are attached to the shoot. and hence the name. And that's why these are easily missed. Now, it is a soft scale, so it does produce honeydew. And that's quite often what people notice first. I've seen some trees that almost glisten with the honeydew. And obviously they can suck enough sap out of it that you see trees that have already lost a lot of needles that are fairly open because of this. But notice that, I mean, it looks literally like buds on it. Now I can find this on white spruce anywhere in the state, but also in little communities in the Black Hills. So you can find it throughout. Common hosts are Colorado spruce, what we call blue spruce, Norway spruce, and they seem to really love Norway spruce. And then, of course, white spruce, what we often refer to as Black Hills spruce. And they can become a real problem and do sometimes require treatments. There's the nymph. Like I said, they look like little pancakes as they're wandering about the place to find a place to feed. Now, the egg hatch here is later than a lot of the ones that we mentioned already, at about 880 growing degree days, which is about the time panicle hydrangea begins to bloom. And by that time, too, little leaf lindens are almost at full bloom. Just seeing a few flowers starting on the panicle hydrangeas. So again, we're coming up to that window for treatment here relatively soon in the state. And you'll notice that it looks an awful lot like the other soft scales, hundreds of eggs laid over a fairly long time period. Crawlers move out, feed on the needles, migrate back to the shoots. And again, soft scales will do that. Resume feeding in the spring and then become adults, which will lay the eggs. And then real quick, I want to mention this one, elongate hemlock scale. It's not a problem in South Dakota. It's not a real threat yet in South Dakota. We don't have a lot of hemlocks, but I should mention this also will feed on firs, and it can feed on spruce, though we haven't found that yet. But the only reason I mention it is while I took that picture in South Dakota, where did I get the scale? Off wreaths. Yeah, this scale, which was accidentally introduced from Asia, infected trees in New York, migrated down to the Carolinas, and then infected fir Christmas tree plantations. And by that, ones where they cut the firs to make wreaths and that, and the scales got transported. And the scale's been around for a long time, so this isn't a very quick thing. But nevertheless, in Minnesota and South Dakota, our concern on this is we don't need another pest on spruce. And the scale, if someone just tosses the wreaths out on a compost bin, well, they might overwinter and survive and migrate. Again, birds can move them into spruce trees and start causing problems there. It's not a major concern, but nevertheless, it's a new pest on the radar here. Well, how are we going to manage these insects? First of all, and this is very important, natural enemies do most of the work. You see this Leucanium scale? You see the little dots on the top? That's not holes where the young nymphs crawled out. They'll crawl underneath the dead mom. Those holes are where this was parasitized and that insect came out. All right. In other words, that was killed by something. So we have an awful lot of insects that will parasitize scales. We also have predators. Lady beetles love to munch on these things. And you see, I've got a picture here of one that's just as happy as a lady beetle could be, munching away on all the little nymphs that are trying to scurry away from it on a spruce tree. So most of the time we don't have to treat in order to manage these. By the way, that's the same spruce tree 2 years later. That's how good they can be. That's why a lot of our scale populations just kind of expand and contract on their own, because the predators and parasitoids are very quick to take advantage of a food source and will literally hammer it back. which brings out an important concern. Now, this is a Scots pine that looks horrible. Needles are anemic, they're a thin canopy. They thought maybe pine wilt disease, but no, this doesn't have any of the symptoms of pine wilt. But when I got up close to it, I started noticing, well, look at a little sooty mold on this and little stickiness. And it was literally covered with pine tortoise scale. And all the Scots pines were to the point they were losing them. And what was the problem here? This isn't a picture of that, but it's just a picture I have. This is from Michigan, where I lived for a while. And one of the things that they've noticed, and Michigan was one of the first, if you're in a town that does a lot of mosquito spraying, you can have a lot of scales. Why? Because you're killing everything that feeds on the scales, and their populations just go crazy. So in some areas, for example, on the golf course, I said, well, I know you got to spray for mosquitoes, but here's how far you want to stay away from your pines, so you're not going to kill everything that's feeding on the scale insects. And again, we have some communities in South Dakota do a lot of mosquito spraying. I can understand why. Nobody likes to smack them, but there are consequences to that. And one is a buildup of scales, because we're killing everything that eats the scales. The other thing, for those people from West River, what we saw after the end of the mountain pine beetle epidemic? Just an outburst of striped scale on ponderosa pines. Why? Because there were some landowners, despite the fact we told them not to do this, they were not just spraying the pine tree or two next to their house to protect it from mountain pine beetle, which we certainly recommended. They were spraying entire acreages. Some people were spraying by the acre every tree. Well, you 5 years in a row spraying every tree over 10 acres, guess what? You've killed everything that eats stripe scale, and those populations just exploded. A few years later, they faded away. Why? Because now that the trees weren't being sprayed for mountain pine beetle, the population of the predators and parasitoids could rebound. But notice my point. Most of the time, the best treatment is leave nature to take its own course. So again, one of the best is just, okay, yeah, there's scales, just let them go. They usually don't cause significant harm to the host. Yes, the honeydew can be a problem. Now, if you've got a tree that looks like this, yeah, you're going to have to treat it. So I'm not saying that no treatment's ever advised. In fact, in a number of times, treatments are valuable, but it doesn't mean that if you find one, you should start treating. Oh, I thought I'd mention this. Here's a real soft approach, no pun intended. Scrape them off. Now, you'll find this as a recommendation that on armored scales, the oyster shell scales, for example, you can literally go out with one of these dish sponges here and scrape them off. Now, you'll read about this as a recommendation. I don't know anyone who has that much free time to do this. It must be a good thing if you're retired and have, well, I'd go fish if I were you. But if you have no other things to occupy your day, you can go out there and scrub your trees down. Your neighbors may ask why, but you will scrape off all the scales with eggs underneath them if you did that in kind of April. Most of them aren't going to do that. We're going to rely on pesticides at some point. So let's take a look at that. First of all, we can do soil injections of insecticides to manage scales. We can also do trunk injections. Both those are means of reducing the exposure of the chemical to the parasitoids and predators that are out there feeding on them, particularly by injecting it in the trunk, or in some cases, you could spray these as a basal spray on the lower trunk of the tree. And by doing these means, you're reducing the impact on everything that feeds on the scales. Now, here's an important note again, though. If you have an armored scale, most of the neonics that we use are ineffective. All right. And because why? Because they feed on cell contents. And so they really don't absorb enough of it. Also, remember, if you're going to spray for them, the egg hatches over a very short time period. So this armored scales at the mouth part kind of snakes around to burst cells. They're not going to pick up enough of the neonics to really do any effective control. The soft scales, you bet. Crawlers feed on the foliage, fairly easy to find. They feed in the phloem tissue. So yes, the neonics you put inside the tree, yep, they're gonna easily kill them. Very effective. And since egg hatches over weeks, this is a good way to do it. But diterferon is actually one that is highly effective, and it's effective against armored scales and soft scales because of its high water solubility and mobility. So any chemical that has this active ingredient that's labeled for scales is effective. And so this can be used as a soil or trunk injection. It will take about 2 to 3 weeks to reach the canopy of the tree, remember, where they're all feeding. So again, this you want to apply about 2 to 3 weeks before the egg hatch, before the crawlers are out, which means in some cases, you really need to get out there now for large trees. If you're doing the imidacropins and that, these are not effective against armored scales. Again, as I mentioned before, a lot of them are not. And if you're doing for soft scales, in which they're highly effective, soil or trunk injections, it's going to take 4 weeks or more for large trees. So on these, you want to get them in about a month at least before egg hatch. So timing's very critical. I should also mention too, there's softer approaches. We have products such as Distance, which is a insect growth regulator. It interferes with the molding process on them. So this one is applied at egg hatch. It's as a foliar spray. It will kill the crawlers, but because of its chemistry, has very little impact on pollinators and on the natural enemies of crawlers. Now, again, read and follow label directions, and this is not an endorsement of any specific product. And these are for commercial applicators in this case. But nevertheless, this is a product that can be used, and a product that can be used by homeowners as well are soaps and oils. Now, soaps are very effective on soft scale crawlers, but do note mountain ash and horse chestnuts, excuse me, I should have finished that, is very sensitive. They are very sensitive to soap. So read and follow label directions. These you'd apply at peak egg hatch. Now, remember, soft scale crawlers come out over a long time period. You might actually have to do more than one application. Armored scale crawlers, the oils are very effective against. And note here again, maples are very sensitive to oils. And no matter what tree, do not apply when air temperatures are over 85 degrees or 90% humidity. That'll be phytotoxic as well. And these you want to apply at peak egg hatch. Now, the nice thing with the armored scale, the egg hatch is over only a week or two, meaning you've got to get that time fairly quickly. Hence, follow degree days or follow plant phenology. But these are all very good products to use. And I strongly recommend using soaps and oils when appropriate, because that's the lightest touch you're going to do. And for commercial applicators, these insect growth regulators are highly effective as well. So we're just about at the end here. So thank you for watching. Again, there's my email address for those that might have some questions afterwards that come up if you're watching this as a recording. And there is my cell phone number that if you need to text me a question, please go ahead and do so. And I'm going to kick this last slide up, and Tony can give me any questions.